March 31st, 1985. Madison Square Garden. Vince McMahon Jr. was about to find out if his company would survive the night or go completely bankrupt. He had mortgaged his house and borrowed against everything his family owned, signed massive contracts with wrestlers like Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant, and spent a fortune on celebrities like Mr. T and Cyndi Lauper. The WWF was hemorrhaging money, and this one event, WrestleMania, was either going to save everything or destroy the McMahon family forever. So, how did Vince McMahon end up in this desperate position in the first place? Cable television was changing everything. Wrestling shows could now reach audiences across the entire country, instead of just one region. In the early 1980s, professional wrestling operated like a carefully organized club. The Worldwide Wrestling Federation controlled the Northeast. The American Wrestling Association ran the Midwest. World Class Championship Wrestling owned Dallas. These promoters had an understanding. You stay in your area, I'll stay in mine, and nobody gets hurt. This system worked for generations. Wrestling families like the Harts, the Gagnes, and the McMahons built their businesses knowing they had protected territories. Vince McMahon Sr. ran the WWF in the Northeast and never tried to expand beyond New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. His son had different ideas. Vince McMahon Jr. saw something the old-timers missed. McMahon Jr. started breaking every unwritten rule in the wrestling business. He began expanding the WWF beyond the Northeast, something that violated decades of gentlemen's agreements. Other promoters had always respected these boundaries. They traded talent occasionally and helped each other out when needed. McMahon threw all of that out the window. He started broadcasting WWF programming in territories that belonged to other promoters. He was essentially declaring war on the entire wrestling establishment. The backlash was immediate and intense. Other territory owners saw McMahon as a threat to their livelihoods and their families' legacies. These weren't just business disagreements. Wrestling families had controlled their regions for generations, passing down promotions from father to son. McMahon was threatening to destroy everything they had built. The other promoters started warning wrestlers that working for McMahon could end their careers elsewhere. Hulk Hogan later revealed that promoters were telling wrestlers that if they went to work for McMahon, they might never come back again. McMahon's expansion strategy required massive upfront costs with no guaranteed returns. He had to pay for television time in new markets, travel expenses for wrestlers going to different regions, and production costs for better shows. Traditional wrestling revenue came from ticket sales at local venues, and maybe some merchandise. McMahon was betting he could generate enough money through television deals and bigger events to cover these enormous expenses. He was essentially gambling his family's business on an untested business model. The talent raids made everything worse. McMahon didn't just want to expand geographically. He wanted the best wrestlers from every territory. His biggest target was Hulk Hogan, who was already becoming a major star in the AWA under Verne Gagne. Hogan had the look, the charisma, and the connection with audiences that McMahon needed for national expansion. When McMahon signed Hogan away from the AWA, he was directly violating the agreements that had kept the wrestling world stable for decades. Verne Gagne was furious about losing Hogan. The AWA had invested time and money in building Hogan's career, and now McMahon was stealing their biggest star. Verne's response showed just how desperate the situation had become. The Iron Sheik, who was trained by Verne, revealed that he was offered $100,000 to injure Hulk Hogan and take the WWF Championship belt to the AWA. This wasn't just business anymore. This was personal warfare between wrestling families. The Iron Sheik had to make a choice that would define his career. He could take Verne's money and potentially end Hogan's career, or he could stick with McMahon's plan. Sergeant Slaughter, who was also trained by Verne, supported working with McMahon. $100,000 is nothing. We're going to make millions working with Vince, Slaughter said. The Iron Sheik ultimately refused Verne's offer and lost the title to Hogan, solidifying Hogan's position as the face of the WWF. McMahon was also signing other major stars like Jesse Ventura and Mean Gene Okerlund from the AWA. Each signing made more enemies and cost more money. These weren't just regular wrestler salaries. McMahon was paying premium prices to steal talent from established territories. He was essentially buying his way into a war that he might not be able to win. The other promoters were uniting against him, sharing information about his tactics and coordinating their responses. The established wrestling families viewed McMahon's actions as a betrayal of everything the industry represented. Wrestling had always been about respect, tradition, and family legacy. McMahon was treating it like any other business where the biggest company could simply buy out the competition. Promoters who had worked together for decades were now seeing their wrestlers, their television time slots, and their audiences disappear to McMahon's expanding empire. McMahon had already made too many enemies to turn back. He had burned bridges with almost every major promoter in the country. The AWA hated him for stealing Hogan. World-class championship wrestling was fighting him for television markets. The Hart family in Calgary was watching him expand into their territory. McMahon's aggressive expansion had put him in a position where he had to go all in or lose everything. There was no middle ground anymore. This territorial war was already costing McMahon a fortune before WrestleMania was even conceived. The expansion costs, talent acquisitions, and legal battles were draining money faster than traditional wrestling revenue could replace it. McMahon had bet everything on his vision of national wrestling, but the financial reality was becoming impossible to ignore. By 1984, McMahon wasn't just spending money. He was hemorrhaging it at a rate that would make most business owners panic. The WWF was losing thousands of dollars every week, and the bills kept piling up. McMahon had committed to a national expansion that required him to spend money he didn't have on talent. He couldn't guarantee would draw crowds. Gate receipts from local shows and basic television deals weren't enough to fund his ambitious vision of turning wrestling into a national entertainment empire. McMahon had borrowed against everything his family owned to keep the expansion going. He took out loans using the family business as collateral, putting his father's legacy at risk. The WWF offices, the television production equipment, and even personal assets were all on the line. The situation became so desperate that McMahon mortgaged his house without telling his wife Linda. He was essentially betting his family's entire financial future on an untested business model that had never worked in wrestling before. The costs of national expansion were staggering in ways that traditional wrestling promoters had never experienced. Travel costs were crushing the company's budget, but McMahon never had a backup plan if WrestleMania flopped. The production costs for better television shows required new equipment, better lighting, and more camera crews. McMahon was spending money on production values that other wrestling promoters considered unnecessary luxuries. Facility rentals in new markets cost far more than McMahon had anticipated. Securing television time slots in major cities required upfront payments that often exceeded the revenue from those markets. McMahon was paying premium prices to get WWF programming on television stations that had never shown wrestling before. Many of these stations demanded guaranteed payment regardless of ratings or advertising revenue. The company was essentially paying for the privilege of trying to build new audiences in territories that might never accept WWF programming. McMahon faced constant pressure from creditors who wanted their money back. Bank officials were calling regularly, demanding updates on repayment schedules. The company's credit lines were maxed out, and traditional lenders were becoming reluctant to extend more financing. McMahon's personal credit was also stretched to its limits. He had co-signed for company loans, meaning his personal assets were at risk if the WWF couldn't make payments. The very real possibility of losing his family's legacy weighed heavily on every financial decision. Traditional wrestling revenue streams weren't designed to support McMahon's ambitious vision. Wrestling had always been a regional business with modest profits. Gate receipts from local shows provided steady but limited income. Television deals in the wrestling world were typically small-scale arrangements with local stations. Merchandise sales were minimal compared to other entertainment industries. Regional promoters had never attempted a national pay-per-view event. The mounting pressure intensified as expenses continued to climb while profits remained uncertain. Every month brought new bills for talent, travel, and production costs. Television ratings in new markets were inconsistent, making it difficult to predict advertising revenue. Ticket sales varied dramatically from city to city, with some markets embracing WWF programming while others rejected it completely. McMahon was spending money at a fixed rate while income fluctuated wildly based on factors he couldn't control. McMahon's financial situation became increasingly desperate as 1984 progressed into 1985. The company was burning through cash reserves at an unsustainable rate. Traditional wrestling shows weren't generating enough revenue to cover the massive fixed costs of national expansion. McMahon needed a breakthrough that would either validate his expensive strategy or provide enough revenue to pay down the mounting debts. The normal wrestling business model simply couldn't support the financial structure he had created. McMahon himself acknowledged the immense risk, stating that WrestleMania was the biggest gamble of his life. He had put all his money on the line, betting that the event would make his business soar. The financial risk was so significant that the success or failure of WrestleMania would determine the fate of the WWF and McMahon's family legacy. Industry insiders recognized the precariousness of McMahon's position, with some predicting the WWF's imminent collapse if WrestleMania failed. The situation reached a crisis point when McMahon mortgaged his house to fund WrestleMania. This personal financial risk demonstrated the depth of his desperation and the high stakes involved. McMahon was literally betting his family's home on a single wrestling event. Failure would mean complete financial ruin for the McMahon family. The company's survival depended entirely on creating an event that could generate massive revenue in one night. McMahon's financial desperation was about to get worse. The money he was spending on facilities and production was nothing compared to what he was about to invest in talent. Every major signing would push him deeper into debt. But without the biggest names in wrestling, WrestleMania would never draw the crowds he needed to survive. McMahon's talent strategy meant buying lottery tickets that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars each. Every contract he signed represented a massive financial commitment that the WWF had to honor, regardless of whether fans showed up or bought tickets. These weren't typical wrestling deals where wrestlers got paid based on gate receipts. McMahon was offering guaranteed contracts that promised specific amounts whether the wrestlers succeeded or failed completely. The signing of Hulk Hogan from Vern's American Wrestling Association became the most expensive gamble in McMahon's expansion strategy. Hogan was already the most charismatic wrestler in the business, but McMahon recognized his potential to become the face of a national wrestling company. The contract McMahon offered Hogan included guaranteed money that far exceeded what most wrestlers made in an entire year. This wasn't just a salary increase. McMahon was betting that Hogan's appeal would translate to massive television audiences and sold-out arenas across the country. McMahon's financial commitment to Hogan created pressure that went far beyond normal business risks. The guaranteed money meant that even if the WWF didn't immediately draw massive crowds, Hogan would still receive his full payment. McMahon was promising to pay superstar money before proving that his national expansion could generate superstar revenue. When Hogan defeated the Iron Sheik at Madison Square Garden on January 23, 1984, to win the WWF Championship, McMahon's investment was already locked in. The success of WrestleMania became directly tied to justifying these enormous contracts that were already draining the company's resources. The Iron Sheik's loyalty to McMahon revealed just how high the stakes had become. Vern, furious about losing Hogan to the WWF, offered the Iron Sheik $100,000 to injure Hogan during their championship match and take the belt back to the AWA. The Iron Sheik refused, later explaining that he chose to honor his commitment to McMahon, despite the massive payout being offered. This single decision solidified Hogan's championship reign and McMahon's roster strategy, but it also showed how desperate the territorial war had become. Roddy Piper's acquisition came with similar financial guarantees that increased McMahon's risk exponentially. Piper had built his reputation across multiple territories as one of wrestling's most effective villains. His appearances on MTV had given him mainstream recognition that McMahon needed for his crossover strategy. McMahon needed a heel who could work with Hogan and generate the kind of heat that would draw paying customers. Piper's contract included guaranteed payment regardless of how audiences responded to his character in the WWF. McMahon was betting that Piper's ability to make fans angry would translate directly into ticket sales and television ratings. Andre the Giant's involvement represented perhaps the most expensive single investment in McMahon's roster strategy. Andre commanded appearance fees that reflected his status as a global wrestling icon. His mere presence on a wrestling card could sell tickets, but his contract demands were astronomical compared to typical wrestling salaries. McMahon needed Andre for WrestleMania's credibility, but the financial commitment required to secure Andre's participation added another layer of risk to an already dangerous financial situation. The pressure these guaranteed contracts put on McMahon's already strained finances created a situation where failure meant complete financial ruin. Traditional wrestling revenue streams couldn't support the fixed costs of these high-dollar contracts. McMahon had committed to paying superstar salaries before proving that his business model could generate superstar revenue. Every month brought guaranteed payments to wrestlers regardless of whether their matches drew crowds or generated television ratings. Each new signing increased the stakes and the potential for catastrophic failure in ways that traditional wrestling promoters had never experienced. McMahon wasn't just adding wrestlers to his roster. He was adding fixed expenses that had to be paid whether the WWF succeeded or failed completely. The cumulative effect of these guaranteed contracts created a financial structure that required unprecedented success just to break even. Moderate success would still mean financial disaster for the McMahon family. McMahon had to deliver massive audiences to justify these enormous talent investments that were already straining the company's resources. The wrestlers he had signed commanded their high salaries based on their ability to draw crowds and generate revenue. McMahon needed to prove that his national expansion could deliver audiences large enough to justify these premium contracts. The success of individual wrestlers became directly tied to the survival of the entire company. The roster investments had created financial obligations that traditional wrestling revenue couldn't support. McMahon had assembled a roster of proven stars, but their combined contracts created fixed expenses that required revolutionary success to justify. The financial pressure from these contracts made WrestleMania's success absolutely critical for the company's survival. But McMahon wasn't finished spending money on his vision of wrestling as mainstream entertainment. McMahon's next move would either create magic or the most expensive disaster in entertainment history. The Rock and Wrestling Connection became his strategy to bring wrestling into the mainstream by partnering with MTV and pop music stars. This wasn't just about adding celebrities to wrestling matches. McMahon was betting that he could create an entirely new form of entertainment that would attract audiences who had never watched wrestling before. The partnership started when Captain Lou Albano met Cyndi Lauper on a plane. Their meeting led to joint shows that blended wrestling with pop culture in ways that had never been attempted before. The MTV specials, The Brawl to End It All, and The War to Settle the Score built anticipation by showing that wrestling could work alongside mainstream entertainment. McMahon saw this as his opportunity to reach audiences beyond traditional wrestling demographics. Bringing in Mr. T and Cyndi Lauper was either genius or complete career suicide for McMahon and the WWF. Mr. T was known for his role in Rocky III alongside Hulk Hogan, making him the perfect celebrity to pair with Hogan for WrestleMania. His tough guy image and mainstream popularity could bring in audiences who watched action movies but had never attended wrestling matches. Cyndi Lauper's involvement through her management of Wendy Richter had already proven that pop stars could generate interest in wrestling storylines. The enormous appearance fees celebrities commanded added another layer of financial pressure to McMahon's already strained budget. Mr. T's appearance fee was rumored to rival top Hollywood rates, representing a significant portion of the event's total costs. Cyndi Lauper's involvement required payment for her appearances at multiple events leading up to WrestleMania. These weren't typical wrestling salaries based on gate receipts or merchandise sales. Celebrities demanded guaranteed payment regardless of how well the event performed. Traditional wrestling fans might reject the celebrity integration entirely, creating a scenario where McMahon could lose his core audience without gaining new viewers. Wrestling fans were passionate about the sport's traditions and authenticity. They had supported wrestling because they believed in the competition and the storylines. Adding celebrities who hadn't earned their place in wrestling could alienate fans who saw this as a betrayal of what wrestling represented. The main event structure with Hulk Hogan and Mr. T versus Roddy Piper and Paul Orndorff represented the ultimate test of McMahon's celebrity strategy. Hogan was already established as the WWF's biggest star, but pairing him with Mr. T created questions about whether fans would accept a non-wrestler in the main event. Piper's real resentment at having to work with Mr. T added genuine tension to the storyline. Piper felt that Mr. T, who had not paid his dues in the wrestling world, did not fully appreciate the craft. McMahon was gambling that celebrities would bring in new audiences without alienating existing fans who had supported wrestling for decades. The celebrity strategy required a perfect balance between mainstream appeal and wrestling authenticity. New viewers needed to understand the storylines and characters without extensive wrestling knowledge. Existing fans needed to feel that the celebrities respected wrestling traditions and weren't just using the platform for publicity. The celebrity strategy had never been tested on this scale before, making McMahon's gamble even more dangerous. Previous celebrity appearances in wrestling had been limited to small roles or one-time appearances. McMahon was building an entire event around celebrity involvement, making them central to the storylines and main attractions. The MTV specials had generated interest, but these were television specials rather than major live events. The extensive promotion for WrestleMania included a Saturday Night Live appearance by Hulk Hogan and Mr. T, demonstrating how far McMahon was willing to go to promote the celebrity crossover. This mainstream promotion represented additional costs and risks for the WWF. If the celebrity strategy failed, McMahon would have spent enormous amounts of money on promotion that didn't generate the intended results. The integration of celebrities into wrestling represented a fundamental shift in how wrestling presented itself to the public. McMahon was essentially arguing that wrestling could be mainstream entertainment rather than a niche sport with limited appeal. This required him to change not just individual matches, but the entire presentation and marketing of wrestling as entertainment. McMahon's celebrity strategy was an all-or-nothing bet that would define the future of wrestling entertainment. The financial investments in celebrity appearances, the promotional costs, and the risk of alienating existing fans created a situation where moderate success would still mean failure. All these expensive elements were coming together for one massive night that would either vindicate McMahon's vision or destroy everything he had built. The venue costs alone made this the most expensive wrestling show ever attempted. Madison Square Garden rental fees cost thousands of dollars for a single night, far beyond the high school gyms and small arenas that most wrestling promoters used. The closed-circuit television network required securing movie theaters, convention centers, and arenas in dozens of cities simultaneously, with each location needing its own technical setup and promotional campaign. The satellite feed technology needed to broadcast the event live to all these locations was cutting-edge and expensive, requiring McMahon to compete with established entertainment companies for satellite access at premium rates. The guaranteed payouts promised to stars like Hogan, Piper, and Andre, regardless of the event's success, created fixed costs that could bankrupt the company. Hulk. Hogan's contract guaranteed him substantial money, whether WrestleMania sold out or completely failed. Roddy Piper received similar guarantees that reflected his status as one of wrestling's top villains. Andre the Giant commanded appearance fees that exceeded what most wrestlers made in an entire year. These weren't performance-based payments that most wrestling promoters used. McMahon was promising specific amounts of money that had to be paid no matter what happened on March 31st. Production values for WrestleMania required investments that made typical wrestling shows look cheap by comparison. The spectacle included Liberace as the guest timekeeper, adding Hollywood glamour that had never been seen in wrestling before. The visual presentation was designed to create a spectacular experience that would impress both live audiences and closed-circuit viewers across the country. McMahon hired professional television production crews who had experience with major sporting events, creating production standards that wrestling had never attempted before. Marketing and promotional costs escalated beyond anything the wrestling industry had seen before. McMahon needed to advertise WrestleMania in dozens of cities simultaneously, requiring newspaper ads, radio spots, and television commercials in multiple markets. The promotional campaign included appearances by wrestlers on talk shows, interviews with sports reporters, and publicity events in major cities. Each promotional appearance required travel expenses, hotel costs, and sometimes appearance fees for the wrestlers. McMahon was essentially running separate marketing campaigns in every city where closed-circuit locations were scheduled. Celebrity fees added another massive expense that traditional wrestling promoters never faced. Mr. T's appearance fee reflected his status as a major Hollywood star rather than a wrestling performer. Cyndi Lauper's involvement required payment for multiple appearances leading up to WrestleMania, not just the event itself. These celebrity fees were guaranteed payments that had to be made regardless of how well the event performed. McMahon was paying Hollywood rates for performers who had no guarantee of drawing wrestling audiences. Every aspect of WrestleMania was designed to maximize both appeal and expense in ways that reflected McMahon's all-or-nothing approach. The venue selection, production values, celebrity involvement, and nationwide broadcast all represented the most expensive options available. McMahon wasn't trying to create a successful wrestling show. He was trying to create a mainstream entertainment spectacle that would establish new standards for what wrestling could be. Each decision increased both the potential impact and the financial risk of the entire event. Industry insiders predicted WWF's collapse if WrestleMania failed, with some promoters hoping for McMahon's failure. The consensus among wrestling veterans was that the financial structure McMahon had created required unprecedented success just to break even. Traditional wrestling shows could be profitable with modest attendance and basic production values. WrestleMania needed to generate massive revenue just to cover its enormous fixed costs. The break-even point was higher than the total revenue of most wrestling events. Wrestlers like Tito Santana and Brutus Beefcake were positioned to either elevate the company or go down with it, depending on their ability to connect with the massive audience McMahon was trying to reach. David Sammartino carried additional pressure as the son of wrestling legend Bruno Sammartino. His match represented both the wrestling tradition that McMahon was trying to honor and the new direction he was taking the company. The pressure on these performers was immense because their success was vital to the financial viability of WrestleMania. Hulk Hogan himself acknowledged the high stakes, stating, "This guy's going to piss everybody off, all these little territories. Vince is going to get everybody so mad that everybody who works on the WrestleMania card will be blackballed." The crowd of 19,121 packed Madison Square Garden had no idea they were about to witness the most important night in wrestling history. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of wrestling fans were sitting in movie theaters and arenas across 135 venues nationwide, watching the action unfold on closed-circuit television. The atmosphere inside MSG was unlike anything wrestling had seen before. This wasn't just another wrestling show. People could feel that something special was happening, with wrestling fans who had followed the WWF for years sitting alongside new faces drawn in by the celebrity involvement and mainstream media coverage. Backstage, the tension reached crisis levels when Mr. T nearly didn't show up to the event. Security found him walking around Central Park just hours before the main event, apparently having second thoughts about his wrestling debut. The wrestlers understood that if WrestleMania failed, they might never work in wrestling again. Hulk Hogan was feeling the pressure of being the face of McMahon's national expansion, while Roddy Piper had his own concerns about working with a celebrity who hadn't paid his dues in wrestling. The opening match between Tito Santana and the Executioner set the tone for everything that followed. Santana won with a flying forearm, and the crowd's genuine enthusiasm showed they were ready to embrace what the WWF was offering. King Kong Bundy vs. SD Jones created the first truly shocking moment when Bundy crushed Jones in just 9 seconds with an avalanche splash. The quick finish created instant buzz throughout Madison Square Garden and proved that WrestleMania would be full of surprises. Matt Bourne vs. Ricky Steamboat provided the technical showcase that proved wrestling quality could coexist with spectacle. Steamboat's athletic ability and innovative moves demonstrated that wrestlers were legitimate athletes who deserved respect. The crowd's appreciation for Steamboat's performance validated McMahon's belief that audiences would embrace wrestling as both sport and entertainment. David Sammartino vs. Brutus Beefcake carried special significance because of Bruno Sammartino's involvement. When Bruno appeared at ringside to support his son, the crowd erupted with the loudest reaction of the night so far. Bruno represented wrestling's proud tradition, and his presence at WrestleMania showed that the old guard was passing the torch to McMahon's new vision. The women's match between Wendy Richter and Leilani Kai showcased the Rockin' Wrestling connection with Cyndi Lauper at ringside. When Richter won the women's championship, Lauper's celebration created a moment that perfectly captured what McMahon was trying to achieve. The crowd's reaction showed that mixing wrestling with pop culture could work if done correctly. Andre the Giant's appearance created the most memorable moment of the evening before the main event. When Andre challenged anyone in the audience to slam him, the entire arena came alive. The Body Slam Challenge segment had the crowd on their feet, cheering for regular fans who tried to move the Giant. Andre's presence gave WrestleMania the credibility it needed while creating an interactive moment that engaged the audience in ways traditional wrestling never had. The main event, featuring Hulk Hogan and Mr. T versus Roddy Piper and Paul Orndorff, was the celebrity spectacle that everything hinged on. Mr. T's actual wrestling performance exceeded all expectations, showing that he had taken the time to learn basic wrestling moves and understood how to work with the crowd. His involvement felt natural rather than forced, proving that celebrities could enhance wrestling rather than diminish it. Hogan's leg drop victory and the post-match celebration brought the house down in ways that surprised even the wrestlers involved. When Hogan pinned Piper for the victory, the celebration felt like a genuine moment of triumph rather than just another wrestling finish. The crowd's reaction showed that they had invested emotionally in the outcome, which was exactly what McMahon needed. The live crowd's energy translated perfectly through closed-circuit feeds across the country, creating a national phenomenon that no one had anticipated. Fans in movie theaters and arenas were reacting as if they were inside Madison Square Garden. The closed-circuit technology allowed the excitement to spread nationwide, making WrestleMania feel like a shared cultural experience rather than just a wrestling show. The financial numbers started coming in almost immediately after the event ended. Madison Square Garden generated $1.1 million in ticket sales, which was impressive for a single wrestling show. The closed-circuit revenue exceeded everyone's expectations, with over $12 million from purchases across the 135 venues. These figures were unlike anything the wrestling industry had ever seen before. When McMahon realized the gamble had paid off and the company was saved, the relief was overwhelming. As McMahon himself stated, with the success of WrestleMania, it really put us on the map, and that was the defining moment of what we know now as the WWE. The financial success meant that the WWF could continue its national expansion and invest in bigger stars and better production values. But what McMahon didn't realize that night was that he had done something far more significant than just saving his company. The territory system that had ruled wrestling for decades crumbled overnight. McMahon's desperate gamble on March 31, 1985, didn't just save his company, it created the blueprint for turning wrestling into a billion-dollar entertainment empire. That single night of financial terror became the foundation for WWE's global dominance. WrestleMania showed that wrestling could attract mainstream audiences willing to pay premium prices for sports entertainment spectacle. The success fundamentally altered the wrestling landscape, effectively dismantling the regional territory system that had dominated the industry for decades and establishing a new national model for professional wrestling. This gamble created the template for every modern WWE premium live event and global expansion. One man's willingness to risk everything transformed an entire industry and reshaped global sports entertainment for decades. What was your favorite WrestleMania moment? Drop a comment below and let us know. Like and subscribe for 100 years of luck. Until next time.